This story is entirely fictional, created in memory of our beloved Pope. Rest in peace, Pope Francis. This story unfolds the remarkable journey of Pope Francis and his canine companion, Gaucho, exploring how their relationship transforms not just the Pope's personal life, but also becomes a living embodiment of his vision for the Church. Through their shared journey, we witness how the simplest of relationships can illuminate profound theological truths about accompaniment, presence, and the ministry of being with that lies at the heart of the gospel. The Vatican gardens stretched out before him, a tapestry of manicured hedges and ancient olive trees bathed in the golden light of a Roman autumn. Jorge Mario Bergoglio, Pope Francis to the world, walked slowly along the gravel path, his white cassock catching the breeze. At 79, his steps were measured but deliberate, much like his approach to the papacy that had surprised the world 3 years prior. "Your Holiness," called a familiar voice, interrupting his reverie. Francis turned to see Cardinal Pietro Parolin, the Vatican Secretary of State, approaching with unusual haste. Beside him walked a younger priest Francis recognized as Father Antonio, who worked with the Vatican's charitable organizations. "Forgive the interruption," Cardinal Parolin said, inclining his head respectfully. "But Father Antonio has a rather unusual situation that requires your guidance." The younger priest stepped forward, and Francis noticed for the first time that he was holding a leash. At the end of it stood a medium-sized dog with intelligent eyes and a coat the color of caramel and cream. "Your Holiness," Father Antonio began, his Argentine accent matching Francis's own. "This is a situation most delicate. This dog belonged to Sister Maria Concepcion from the Little Sisters of the Poor in Buenos Aires. She passed away last week, God rest her soul." Francis crossed himself automatically, murmuring a brief prayer for the nun he had known during his years as Archbishop of Buenos Aires. Sister Maria was caring for this dog, his name is Gaucho, after finding him abandoned near their convent. Father Antonio continued. "In her final days, she expressed great concern about what would happen to him. She remembered your Holiness's fondness for animals and your conversations about St. Francis of Assisi." Francis looked at the dog again, who tilted his head slightly, ears perked forward. "The sisters contacted me, knowing I would be traveling to Rome this month. They asked if I might." Father Antonio hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the presumption. "If I might inquire whether your Holiness would consider taking him in." Sister Maria believed it would be providential. Cardinal Parolin cleared his throat. "I explained to Father Antonio that this would be highly irregular, your Holiness. The papal apartments are hardly suitable for a pet, and the precedent it would set." Francis raised his hand gently, silencing the cardinal mid-sentence. He stepped forward and crouched down, his knees protesting slightly to meet the dog at eye level. Gaucho remained still, his brown eyes fixed on Francis with what seemed like profound attention. "Gaucho," Francis said softly in Spanish. "What a presumptuous name for such a humble creature." The dog's tail wagged once, tentatively. Francis had never owned a dog, not as Jorge Bergoglio the priest, nor as the Archbishop, nor as Pope. His simple lifestyle and demanding vocation had never allowed for it. Yet something in the animal's steady gaze reminded him of the unconditional trust he had encountered countless times in the slums of Buenos Aires. The unguarded openness of those who have known hardship but not surrendered to cynicism. Sister Maria had a gift for seeing connections others missed, Francis said, more to himself than to the men standing nearby. He reached out slowly, allowing Gaucho to sniff his hand before gently stroking the dog's head. "Perhaps she saw something here too." "Your Holiness," Cardinal Parolin began cautiously, "the practical considerations will be addressed," Francis completed the sentence, rising to his feet with a slight grimace. "God often speaks through the simplest of circumstances, does he not? And we are called to be attentive." The papal apartment was never truly quiet. Even in the pre-dawn hours, there was always movement somewhere. Security details, changing shifts, early rising clerics preparing for morning prayers, the distant hum of Vatican City stirring to life. But on this particular morning, Francis awoke to an unfamiliar sound. The soft padding of paws on marble floors, and the gentle jingle of a collar. For a moment, disorientation clouded his mind. Then reality returned. Gaucho, the dog from Buenos Aires. His dog now, by a decision that had already generated more discussion than he had anticipated. "Buenos dias, Gaucho," he said softly, sitting up. The dog approached his bedside, tail wagging gently in greeting. In the dim light filtering through the curtains, Francis could see the animal's intelligent eyes watching him with what seemed like concern. It had been 3 days since Gaucho's arrival, and the adjustments were ongoing. Father Paolo, Francis's personal secretary, had arranged for all the necessities: food, bedding, veterinary checks, with the efficient discretion that characterized his service. The Swiss guards had been briefed on the new resident, though their stoic expressions had momentarily faltered at the unexpected development. And a young seminarian named Marco, who had worked as a veterinary assistant before entering religious life, had been assigned to help with Gaucho's care when the Pope's schedule required it. Francis rose from bed and knelt for his morning prayers, a practice as essential to him as breathing. Gaucho settled quietly nearby, as if understanding the sacred nature of the moment. There was something comforting about the dog's presence, Francis realized, a living reminder of creation's simplicity amid the often Byzantine complexities of church governance. The headlines appeared faster than even the Vatican's experienced communications team had anticipated. Sonum. Pope's new companion, Francis adopts rescue dog. Papal pup. Francis follows footsteps of namesake with animal companion. Vatican goes to the dogs. Traditional Catholics question Francis's latest move. By the following morning, photographs had somehow emerged. Gaucho walking beside Francis in the Vatican gardens, the Pope bending to stroke the dog's head, the pair sitting together on a bench overlooking Rome. "I believe we have a leak in the Swiss Guard," Cardinal Parolin observed dryly, placing a tablet displaying several news articles on Francis's desk during their morning meeting. These photographs could only have been taken from certain restricted areas. Francis glanced at the images without much concern. "Let them take their pictures. There are far more important matters deserving our attention." But privately, he was disturbed by the invasion of privacy. The gardens had always been his sanctuary, a place where he could walk and pray away from the constant scrutiny that accompanied his public role. Later that afternoon, Francis had scheduled a private audience with a group of refugees who had recently arrived in Italy from various conflict zones. Rather than meeting them in one of the formal reception rooms, he had arranged for the encounter to take place in a smaller, more intimate setting within the Santa Marta residence where he lived. As he prepared to greet them, Francis made a spontaneous decision. "Marco," he called to the young seminarian who had arrived to take Gaucho for his afternoon walk. "I think Gaucho will join us for this meeting." Marco looked surprised. "Are you certain, Your Holiness? He hasn't been introduced to larger groups yet." "These aren't just any group," Francis replied. "These are people who have lost everything. Their homes, often their families, their sense of security. A dog's unconditional welcome might speak more clearly than formal papal protocols." And so, when the 12 refugees, 3 families from Syria, a young man from South Sudan, and 2 women from Afghanistan, were ushered into the meeting room, they found not only the Pope waiting to greet them, but also a caramel-colored dog who approached them with gentle curiosity. The effect was immediate and transformative. The formal tension that typically characterized papal audiences dissolved. A Syrian boy of about 7, who had been clinging nervously to his mother's hand, broke into a smile and asked in halting Italian if he could pet the dog. The Afghan women, who had been keeping their eyes downcast, looked up with interest. The South Sudanese man, tall and solemn, knelt to greet Gaucho at his own level. "His name is Gaucho," Francis explained, watching as the dog moved among the visitors with perfect manners, allowing himself to be petted and offering gentle greeting in return. "He came to me from Argentina, my homeland. Like you, he has made a journey to a new place." "Dogs are the same everywhere," the South Sudanese man observed quietly. "They don't care about borders or papers or whether you belong." "A wisdom we humans often lack," Francis agreed. The meeting that followed was unlike any papal audience these refugees had anticipated. seated in a circle rather than in formal rows, with Gaucho moving occasionally from person to person as if ensuring everyone received attention. They shared their stories with a directness that might have been impossible in a more ceremonial setting. When a Syrian woman broke down while describing how her eldest son had been killed by government forces, Gaucho moved immediately to her side, resting his head against her knee, in a gesture so natural and comforting that it seemed almost planned. The woman's hand found the dog's fur, and her sobs gradually subsided as she stroked his head. "He knows," she said softly in Arabic, which her teenage daughter translated. "He understands sorrow." Francis nodded. Sometimes creatures understand what words cannot express. The November rain fell steadily over Rome, transforming the Vatican gardens into a landscape of glistening pathways and dripping foliage. From his window, Francis watched a pair of groundskeepers struggling with a tarpaulin over a section of delicate plants, their movements hampered by the persistent downpour. "Not a day for our usual walk, I'm afraid," he said to Gaucho, who sat beside him gazing out at the rain with what seemed like philosophical acceptance. It had been nearly 2 months since the dog had entered his life, and their routine had settled into comfortable familiarity. Morning prayers followed by breakfast, then a walk in the gardens before Francis began his day of meetings, audiences, and administrative work. But today's schedule had been disrupted by more than just the weather. Francis had awakened before dawn with a fever and a persistent cough that left him short of breath. At 79, with only one functioning lung due to an infection in his youth, any respiratory illness was cause for concern. His personal physician, Dr. Poliska, had been summoned immediately. "It's bronchitis, Your Holiness," the doctor had pronounced after examination. "Not severe at this point, but given your history, we must be cautious. I'm prescribing antibiotics and recommending you cancel your public appearances for at least 3 days." Francis had protested. There was the weekly general audience tomorrow, meetings with several bishops' conferences, and a scheduled visit to a homeless shelter in Trastevere that he had been particularly looking forward to. "With respect, Holy Father," Dr. Poliska had replied firmly, "your determination is admirable, but medically inadvisable. The Church needs you healthy, not hospitalized with pneumonia." And so reluctantly, Francis had acquiesced. His secretary had already begun the process of rearranging his schedule and preparing appropriate announcements. Now confined to his apartment with strict orders to rest, Francis found himself in the unusual position of having unstructured time. For a man accustomed to days planned in 15-minute increments, the sudden emptiness of his schedule was almost disorienting. Gaucho seemed to sense the change, staying closer than usual, his warm presence a comfort as Francis alternated between reading, praying, and resting. When a coughing fit would overtake him, the dog would watch with evident concern, moving closer as if offering solidarity in suffering. By afternoon, Francis's fever had risen despite the medication, leaving him feeling weak and slightly disoriented. He lay on his bed, a breviary open beside him, though his concentration had faltered. Gaucho lay on the floor nearby, his eyes rarely leaving Francis's face. A knock at the door preceded the entrance of Father Paolo, carrying a tray with tea and medication. "Dr. Poliska will return this evening to check on you, Your Holiness," he said, setting the tray on the bedside table. After Father Paolo had departed, Francis sipped the hot tea, finding some relief in its warmth. His thoughts drifted, fever making the boundaries between reflection and dream permeable. He thought of his mother, Regina Maria Siveri, and how she had cared for him during childhood illnesses in their modest Buenos Aires home. "Madre," he whispered, the Italian word for mother merging with his Spanish memories. Gaucho rose suddenly from his place on the floor and jumped onto the bed, something he had never done before. He settled carefully beside Francis, his warm body providing unexpected comfort. Too weak to object to this breach of boundaries, Francis simply placed his hand on the dog's back, drawing solace from the steady rhythm of his breathing. He must have drifted to sleep, for when he next opened his eyes, the room was dimmer and Dr. Poliska was bending over him, concern evident in his expression. "Your Holiness," the doctor said, "your fever has increased. I'm concerned about the progression of the infection." Francis became aware that several other people were in the room: Father Paolo, Cardinal Parolin, and a nurse he didn't recognize. Gaucho remained on the bed beside him, watching the proceedings with alert attention. Dr. Palisa continued his examination, listening to Francis's chest with a stethoscope and frowning at what he heard. "The infection is moving deeper into the lungs," he said finally. "I believe hospitalization would be the prudent course, Your Holiness." Francis shook his head. "That won't be necessary. Adjust the medication if needed, but I'll recover here." The doctor exchanged glances with Cardinal Parolin. "Your Holiness," the cardinal said gently, "given your medical history, perhaps prudence." "I'm not going to create a media spectacle over bronchitis," Francis interrupted more sharply than he had intended. After some discussion, a compromise was reached. The doctor would adjust the antibiotic regimen and add supplemental oxygen to assist Francis's labored breathing. A nurse would remain overnight to monitor his condition, and if there was no improvement by morning, the question of hospitalization would be revisited. Throughout the conversation, Gaucho had remained motionless beside Francis, as if understanding the gravity of the situation. When the medical equipment was brought in, an oxygen concentrator and monitoring devices, the dog watched with evident curiosity, but didn't interfere or show signs of distress at the unusual activity. "The dog should probably be removed while you're receiving treatment," Dr. Poliska suggested as the nurse prepared the oxygen. Francis placed his hand protectively on Gaucho's back. "He stay," he said simply. "His presence is therapeutic." The night that followed was difficult. Francis's fever continued to rise despite the medication, and his breathing grew more labored. The nurse monitored him constantly, adjusting the oxygen flow and recording his vital signs. During the worst moments, when fever dreams blurred the boundaries of reality, Francis found himself reaching instinctively for Gaucho, who remained steadfastly at his side. Toward dawn, the fever finally broke. Francis awoke to find the first pale light filtering through the curtains and Dr. Polika checking the readings on the monitoring equipment. "Your temperature is down, Your Holiness," the doctor said, evident relief in his voice. "And your oxygen levels have improved. It seems we've turned a corner." Francis nodded, too exhausted to speak. He became aware that Gaucho was no longer on the bed beside him. Turning his head slightly, he saw the dog sitting attentively beside Father Paolo near the door. "He needed to go out briefly," Father Paolo explained, noticing Francis's questioning look. "But he was most reluctant to leave your side. The Swiss guards reported he kept looking back toward the apartment." Francis managed a weak smile. "Faithful companion," he murmured. Several months later, as Francis sat at his desk reviewing documents related to the ongoing investigation of Vatican finances, a painful but necessary process of bringing transparency to institutions long shrouded in secrecy, he found himself particularly troubled. The reports detailed patterns of mismanagement and possible corruption that reached into the highest levels of the Curia. Sighing heavily, Francis removed his reading glasses and rubbed his eyes. The financial reforms he had initiated upon becoming pope had met with stubborn resistance from the beginning. His determination to clean house had made him powerful enemies within the very institutions he was trying to reform. "The money changers in the temple," why he murmured, thinking of Jesus' rare display of righteous anger. "Some things haven't changed in 2,000 years. Gaucho, sensing his distress, rose from his bed in the corner and came to sit beside Francis's chair, resting his head on the Pope's knee. The simple gesture of comfort brought unexpected tears to Francis's eyes. He stroked the dog's head, grateful for the uncomplicated affection. "The Church is both divine and human, Gaucho," he said softly. "Divine in her origin and purpose, but all too human in her failings. Sometimes I wonder if we've lost sight of what matters most." The dog looked up at him with those intelligent brown eyes that seemed to understand far more than should be possible. "Jesus didn't establish a bank or a property management office," Francis continued, giving voice to frustrations he rarely expressed even to his closest advisors. "He didn't create a diplomatic corps or investment portfolios. He founded a community of believers called to proclaim the gospel and serve the least among us." One day, Francis received an unexpected visitor. Cardinal Robert Serra, the Guinean prelate who served as prefect of the Congregation for Divine Worship, had requested a brief audience. Given their often opposing views on liturgical matters and church discipline, Francis was intrigued by the request. When Cardinal Sarah entered the papal study, Francis was seated in an armchair near the window. Gaucho lay at his feet, but rose immediately at the visitor's entrance, approaching the cardinal with polite curiosity. "Your Holiness," Cardinal Sarah said, bowing deeply, "thank you for receiving me, especially during your recovery." "Please sit," Francis gestured to a nearby chair. "And don't mind Gaucho. He likes to greet visitors." The cardinal regarded the dog with an expression Francis couldn't quite interpret. Not discomfort exactly, but a certain wariness. Nevertheless, he extended his hand, allowing Gaucho to sniff it before taking his seat. There was a moment of silence during which Cardinal Sarah seemed to be gathering his thoughts. Francis waited patiently, curious about the purpose of this visit from a man generally considered one of the more conservative voices in the Curia. "I came," the cardinal finally said, "because of something personal that has been on my mind since hearing about your companion." He glanced at Gaucho, who had returned to his position near Francis's feet. "It reminded me of something from my childhood in Guinea." Francis leaned forward slightly intrigued. Cardinal Sarah rarely spoke of his personal history, despite its remarkable trajectory from a remote African village to the highest levels of the Vatican. "When I was a boy, before the missionaries came to our village," the cardinal continued, "my father had a dog. This was unusual in our culture, where dogs were generally seen as working animals for hunting, not companions. But this dog, my father called him Koro, which means elder in our language, was different. He followed my father everywhere." The cardinal's typically austere expression softened slightly at the memory. "When I was sent away to the mission school at 11 years old, leaving my family and traditional religion behind to become Catholic, one of my greatest sorrows was leaving Koro. I didn't understand then why the missionaries didn't have animal companions. It seemed unnatural to me." Francis nodded, encouraging him to continue. "Years later, when I was studying theology in France, I came to understand the philosophical distinctions between humans and animals in Western thought. The emphasis on rational souls, on mankind's unique relationship with the Creator. It made intellectual sense, but something in my heart still remembered the wisdom of my father and his dog." The cardinal straightened in his chair, as if slightly uncomfortable with this revelation of personal feeling. "I say this not to question our theological anthropology, which is sound, but to suggest that perhaps there are cultural dimensions to our understanding of creation that Western theology hasn't fully appreciated." Francis considered this thoughtfully. "The Church is universal, but our theology has often been expressed through particularly European philosophical frameworks," he acknowledged. "Perhaps there is wisdom in other cultural traditions that can enrich our understanding without contradicting essential truths." Cardinal Sarah nodded. "Precisely, Your Holiness. When I saw the reports about your dog, I was initially concerned about the message it might send. But then I remembered Koro and my father's natural wisdom, and I wondered if perhaps this was God's way of reminding us that our understanding of creation is always limited by our cultural perspectives." Francis smiled. "And so you came to tell me the story." "I did," the cardinal confirmed, "and also to see for myself this companion who has caused such discussion within the Curia." Francis gestured toward Gaucho. "He's welcome to approach you if you'd like to make his acquaintance properly." After a moment's hesitation, Cardinal Sarah extended his hand again. "Come," he said softly. Gaucho rose and moved toward the cardinal, his manner respectful but not subservient. He allowed the cardinal to stroke his head, maintaining eye contact in a way that struck Francis as almost ceremonial. "He has dignity," Cardinal Sarah observed quietly. "My father would have approved." The papal plane hummed steadily as it crossed the Mediterranean, leaving the Italian coast behind en route to Morocco. Francis gazed out the window at the expanse of blue below, his thoughts already turning to the challenges and opportunities of the visit ahead. This would be his first trip to the North African kingdom, a nation that, while overwhelmingly Muslim, had a history of relative religious tolerance in a small but ancient Christian community. What made this apostolic journey different from the dozens that had preceded it was the small carrier secured to the floor near his seat. Inside, Gaucho lay quietly, occasionally lifting his head to check his surroundings. before settling back down. After much discussion among Vatican officials, with arguments ranging from protocol concerns to practical logistics, Francis had made the unprecedented decision to bring his dog on an international papal visit. "It's highly irregular, Your Holiness," Cardinal Parolin had protested when Francis first suggested it. "There are the quarantine laws to consider, the diplomatic implications, the additional security concerns," but Francis had been unusually insistent. "King Mohammed VI keeps horses, falcons, and I'm told several dogs," he had pointed out. "I doubt he'll be offended by Gaucho's presence. As for the practical matters, if heads of state can travel with their pets, surely the necessary arrangements can be made for the Pope's dog." The second day of the visit began with a moment that would generate images seen around the world. Francis had arranged to visit a center for migrants on the outskirts of Rabat, a facility operated by Caritas that provided temporary shelter, medical care, and legal assistance to those who had fled poverty and violence in sub-Saharan Africa. When the papal motorcade arrived at the modest compound, Francis had made an unexpected request of his security detail. "I want Gaucho with me for this visit." The head of security had hesitated. "Your Holiness, we haven't prepared for that. The crowds, the unpredictability." "Tom, these people have lost everything familiar," Francis had replied firmly. "Many have been separated from family, from pets, from all the normal comforts of life. Gaucho's presence might speak to them in ways our official words cannot." And so, as Francis stepped from his vehicle to the cheers of the migrants gathered outside the center, Gaucho walked beside him on a simple leash, his manner calm despite the unusual circumstances. The effect was immediate and powerful. Children who had been standing shyly behind their parents stepped forward, their faces lighting up at the sight of the dog. Adults who had maintained a respectful distance, intimidated perhaps by the papal office, moved closer. "You have a dog!" exclaimed a young boy in French-accented English, breaking protocol to approach Francis directly. "Like my dog in Congo." Francis smiled, crouching slightly despite the protest in his knees. "This is Gaucho. Would you like to greet him?" The boy nodded eagerly, and Francis guided him in offering his hand for Gaucho to sniff. The dog responded with gentle courtesy, allowing the child to stroke his head. Soon other children approached, then adults, the formal barriers of the papal visit dissolving into a more human encounter. As Francis moved through the facility, listening to stories of harrowing journeys across deserts and seas, of dreams deferred and families separated, Gaucho walked steadily beside him, occasionally approaching those who seemed most distressed, as if drawn to their particular suffering. A young woman from Cameroon describing how she had been separated from her 3-year-old daughter during an attempted Mediterranean crossing broke down in tears. As Francis held her hands in comfort, Gaucho pressed gently against her legs, offering his own form of solace. The woman's sobs gradually subsided as she reached down to touch the dog. "In my village," she said softly, "we believe animals can see spirits, that they know when a soul is in pain." Francis nodded. "Perhaps they see with a clarity we have lost." The visit extended well beyond its scheduled time, as Francis insisted on hearing as many stories as possible, on blessing as many people as sought his attention. Throughout it all, Gaucho remained a calm, attentive presence, neither disturbed by the crowds nor distracted from his evident sense of purpose. When they finally departed, the director of the center, a Spanish nun who had spent decades working with migrants, walked Francis to his car. "I've never seen them open up like this," she said quietly. "Something about the dog. It reminded them of home, I think, of normal life before everything fell apart." "God works through the simplest instruments," Francis replied. "Sometimes a dog can open doors that remain closed to a pope." The summer heat lay heavy over Rome, transforming the Vatican gardens into a refuge of relative coolness beneath ancient trees. Francis walked slowly along a secluded path, Gaucho trotting ahead, then circling back, a pattern they had established over their year together. The early morning hour, just after 5, afforded a rare privacy that Francis treasured, a chance to pray and think before the day's demands descended. And the demands had been particularly heavy of late. The previous month had seen the publication of his apostolic exhortation, Amoris Laetitia, which addressed family life and included carefully nuanced language about pastoral approaches to divorced and remarried Catholics. The document had been received with predictable polarization, some hailing it as a compassionate application of unchanging doctrine to complex human situations, others warning it undermined the Church's teaching on the indissolubility of marriage. 4 cardinals had recently published a set of dubia, formal questions, challenging aspects of the document, an unusual public move that signaled growing tensions within the Church's hierarchy. Francis had chosen not to respond directly, believing the text spoke for itself, and that dialogue would be better served through private channels than public confrontation. "They think I don't understand the risks," he murmured to Gaucho, who had returned to walk beside him. "As if I haven't spent decades as a priest, bishop, and cardinal wrestling with these very tensions, between truth and mercy, between doctrine and pastoral application." The dog looked up at him with those attentive brown eyes that had become a source of comfort during difficult moments. "The problem, Gaucho, is that some see every pastoral accommodation as a slippery slope toward relativism, while others view every doctrinal boundary as rigid legalism. Finding the middle path, being faithful to the Church's teaching while responding to the messy realities of human life, this is the challenge Christ himself faced with the Pharisees." Francis sighed, feeling the weight of his office particularly heavily this morning. At 80, he was acutely aware of his own mortality and of the limited time he had to help guide the Church toward the vision of missionary discipleship he believed God had called him to foster. As they rounded a bend in the path, Francis noticed a figure seated on a bench ahead, an unusual sight at this early hour when the gardens were typically empty save for the occasional groundskeeper. As they drew closer, he recognized Cardinal Muller, prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, the Vatican's doctrinal office. Francis felt a momentary tension. His relationship with Cardinal Muller had been professional but sometimes strained. The German theologian, appointed to his position by Benedict XVI, represented a more traditional approach to doctrinal questions than Francis's own emphasis on pastoral discernment. "Your Holiness," Cardinal Muller said, rising quickly as Francis approached. "I apologize for interrupting your morning walk." "No apology needed," Francis replied, though he wondered how the cardinal had known his schedule. "The gardens are for reflection, and I am not the only one who needs such moments." Gaucho approached the cardinal with his typical, polite curiosity. After a moment's hesitation, Muller extended his hand, allowing the dog to sniff it before briefly touching his head. "May I walk with you for a moment, Holy Father?" the cardinal asked. "There are matters I feel we should discuss privately." Francis nodded, sensing the seriousness in the other man's tone. They continued along the path, Gaucho now walking between them as if mediating the conversation to come. "I'll speak directly with your Holiness's permission," Cardinal Muller began. "I am concerned about divisions that are developing within the College of Cardinals and the wider Church. The dubia submitted by Cardinals Burke, Brandmuller, Caffarra, and Meissner represent broader questions that many faithful Catholics are asking." Francis maintained a neutral expression. "The Church has always contained different perspectives, different emphases. This is not new. With respect, Holy Father, what is new is the perception that fundamental doctrinal matters are being called into question, particularly regarding the moral teaching on marriage and sexuality." They walked in silence for a moment, the only sound the crunch of gravel beneath their feet and Gaucho's occasional sniff at an interesting scent. "Cardinal Muller," Francis said finally, "do you believe I am undermining Church doctrine?" The directness of the question seemed to catch the cardinal off guard. I believe your Holiness is attempting to make the Church more accessible to those who struggle with certain teachings. But I fear the methods may inadvertently create confusion about whether those teachings remain in effect." Francis nodded thoughtfully. The Pharisees accused Jesus of undermining the law when he healed on the Sabbath or allowed his disciples to pluck grain. His response was that they had missed the purpose of the law, that it was made for man, not man for the law. "But Jesus also said he came not to abolish the law, but to fulfill it," Cardinal Muller countered. "Precisely. And fulfillment sometimes requires us to go deeper than the mere letter, to find the spirit that gives it meaning. Francis paused, considering how to express his vision more clearly. The Church's moral teachings remain. Marriage is indissoluble, but the application of those teachings to complex human situations requires pastoral discernment, not just legal judgment. Throughout their conversation, Gaucho remained attentively between them, occasionally glancing up as if following their theological exchange. One afternoon, Francis received Archbishop Vincenzo Paglia, president of the Pontifical Academy for Life, to discuss upcoming initiatives related to bioethics and human dignity. As they reviewed proposals for conferences and publications, Gaucho lay quietly in his customary spot near Francis's desk. "Your companion seems particularly contemplative today," Archbishop Paglia observed during a pause in their discussion. Francis glanced at Gaucho, who indeed appeared unusually subdued. "Perhaps he's pondering the theological implications of our bioethical frameworks," he joked. But as the meeting continued, Francis noticed that Gaucho remained uncharacteristically still, barely responding when his name was mentioned. When Archbishop Paglia departed, Francis approached the dog with concern. "What's troubling you, my friend?" he asked softly, kneeling despite the protest in his joints. Gaucho raised his head slightly but didn't stand as he typically would. His eyes seemed dull, and when Francis placed a hand on his side, he felt unusual warmth through the fur. Concern growing, Francis called for Father Paolo. "Please contact Marco immediately," he instructed when his secretary appeared. "Something isn't right with Gaucho." Marco arrived quickly, his face showing appropriate concern as he examined the dog. "He has a fever, Your Holiness," he confirmed after taking Gaucho's temperature, "and his breathing seems labored. I think we should have the veterinarian see him as soon as possible." Within the hour, Dr. Elena Rossi, a respected veterinarian who had been quietly added to the Vatican's medical consultants when Gaucho arrived, was examining the dog in Francis's study. Her expression grew increasingly grave as she completed her assessment. "Your Holiness," she said finally, "Gaucho is quite ill. His symptoms suggest a serious infection, possibly pneumonia. I would recommend immediate hospitalization for more thorough diagnostics and treatment." Francis felt a surge of anxiety that surprised him with its intensity. Over the past year, Gaucho had become far more than a pet. He was a constant companion, a source of unconditional support amid the complexities and controversies of papal life. "What would this involve?" he asked, his voice steady despite his concern. Dr. Rossi explained the process. Gaucho would need to be transported to her clinic, where he could receive intravenous antibiotics and supportive care while they determined the exact nature of his illness. He would likely need to remain there for several days at minimum. "I understand," Francis said, nodding slowly. "Please make whatever arrangements are necessary for his care." As preparations were made to transport Gaucho, Francis sat beside him, gently stroking his head and speaking softly in Spanish. Words of reassurance that the dog seemed to understand despite his illness. When the time came for him to be moved, Francis helped lift him carefully onto the stretcher that would carry him to the waiting vehicle. "I'll visit as soon as possible," he promised, watching as Marco accompanied Gaucho and Dr. Rossi from the room. Left alone in his study, Francis was struck by the sudden emptiness. Not just the physical absence of Gaucho, but a deeper sense of something missing from the familiar space. For the first time in over a year, he faced the day's challenges without his faithful companion nearby. That evening, after completing his final commitments, Francis did something unprecedented. He left the Vatican quietly, accompanied only by a single security officer, and traveled to Dr. Rossi's clinic on the outskirts of Rome. The staff had been forewarned of his visit, but were nonetheless visibly nervous as they welcomed the Pope into their modest facility. Dr. Rossi, Gaucho was lying on a padded bed in a glass-fronted enclosure, an IV line attached to his foreleg, and monitoring equipment tracking his vital signs. Despite his evident weakness, he lifted his head when Francis approached, his tail moving in a faint suggestion of its usual greeting. "May I?" Francis asked, gesturing toward the enclosure door. "Of course," Dr. Rossi replied, opening it for him. "Just be careful of the IV line." Francis entered and knelt beside Gaucho's bed, gently placing his hand on the dog's head. "You've caused quite a commotion, my friend," he said softly in Spanish. "The security detail was most put out by this unscheduled excursion. Gaucho's eyes, though dulled by illness, remained fixed on Francis's face. He made a small sound, almost like a sigh, and pressed his head slightly against the Pope's hand. For several minutes, Francis simply sat with him, occasionally speaking quiet words of encouragement, but mostly just providing the comfort of his presence. Dr. Rossi stood respectfully nearby, touched by the evident bond between the elderly pontiff and his canine companion. "He's a fighter, Your Holiness," she said when Francis finally rose to leave. "And he's receiving the best care possible. I'm cautiously optimistic." Francis nodded gratefully. "Thank you, Doctor, for your expertise and for accommodating this unusual visit." "It's an honor," she replied sincerely. "And frankly, it's good medicine. Animals, like people, often respond better when those they love are near." Over the next 3 days, Gaucho's condition improved steadily. The infection responded to the antibiotics, his fever subsided, and his energy began to return. Francis received regular updates and visited once more, finding Gaucho much more alert and responsive. On the 4th day, Dr. Rossi called with good news. Gaucho was well enough to return to the Vatican, though he would need continued medication and restricted activity for at least another week. When Gaucho was finally brought back to the papal apartment, escorted by Marco and Dr. Rossi, Francis felt a wave of relief that surprised him with its intensity. The dog was noticeably thinner and still moved with careful deliberation, but his eyes were bright and his tail wagged with unmistakable joy at returning home. "Welcome back, old friend," Francis said, kneeling to greet him properly. "You've been greatly missed." That evening, as Francis sat at his desk reviewing documents, Gaucho rested on his bed nearby, occasionally sighing contentedly. The familiar rhythm of their companionship had resumed, though altered slightly by the lingering effects of illness. Father Paolo entered with the final correspondence of the day, pausing to smile at the sight of Gaucho back in his accustomed place. "It's good to have him home, Your Holiness." The apartment felt different in his absence. "Indeed," Francis agreed. "It's remarkable how quickly he became essential to this space and to my daily life. If I may say so, Holy Father, his illness affected you more deeply than you perhaps realized. Several of us noticed your concern, though you tried to conceal it." Francis nodded thoughtfully. "When we open ourselves to love, we necessarily open ourselves to the possibility of loss. It's the great paradox of attachment. What brings us joy also brings vulnerability." He glanced at Gaucho, who had drifted to sleep, his chest rising and falling in the steady rhythm of healing rest. But the alternative, closing ourselves off from such connections, would be a greater loss still. One afternoon, about 2 weeks after Gaucho's return, Francis received a visitor he had been anticipating with interest. Rabbi Abraham Skorka, his longtime friend from Buenos Aires. The two had maintained their friendship despite the distance created by Francis's elevation to the papacy, occasionally speaking by phone and meeting when the rabbi's travels brought him to Rome. "Jorge!" Rabbi Skorka exclaimed warmly as he entered the papal study, using the name by which he had known Francis for decades. Despite the formality of the Vatican setting, their relationship remained grounded in their shared experiences in Argentina, where they had co-hosted a television program and co-authored a book on interfaith dialogue. "Abraham," Francis replied with equal warmth, embracing his friend. "It's been too long." Gaucho, who had been dozing near the window, rose to investigate the visitor. Rabbi Skorka looked down with interest. "So this is the famous papal dog I've been reading about. The traditionalists must be scandalized." Francis laughed. "Some are, though others have come around." Cardinal Sarah shared a beautiful reflection on animals in different cultural traditions that surprised me with its depth. The rabbi crouched to greet Gaucho properly, allowing the dog to sniff his hand before gently stroking his head. In Jewish tradition, the treatment of animals has always been seen as a moral issue. The prohibition against causing unnecessary suffering to animals, Za'ar Ba'alei Chayim, is considered an important ethical principle. Christianity inherited this sensitivity, though perhaps we've sometimes neglected it in practice, Francis acknowledged. My namesake, Francis of Assisi, understood the spiritual dimension of our relationship with other creatures. As they settled into comfortable chairs for their conversation, Gaucho positioned himself between them, occasionally glancing from one to the other as if following their exchange. "He seems to be listening to us," Rabbi Skorka observed with amusement. "He often gives that impression," Francis agreed. "During theological discussions, I sometimes fancy he's silently judging our arguments and finding them wanting." When their discussion turned to the recent tensions within the Catholic Church regarding Francis's approach to divorced and remarried Catholics, Rabbi Skorka listened thoughtfully to his friend's explanation of the principles guiding Amoris Laetitia. "You know," the rabbi said when Francis had finished, "there's a parallel in Jewish tradition. The tension between halakha, the law, and agada, the narrative or spiritual dimension. Some rabbis emphasize the strict application of halakhic principles, while others focus more on the underlying values and human realities." Francis nodded, appreciating the comparison. Every religious tradition faces this tension between rules and pastoral application. The challenge is to maintain fidelity to core principles while responding to the complexities of human experience. "And both extremes are problematic," Rabbi Skorka added. "Legalism without compassion becomes rigid and lifeless. Compassion without principles becomes shapeless and ultimately meaningless." "Precisely," Francis agreed. "Finding the balance is the art of spiritual leadership, and one I struggle with daily." In February, as Rome experienced an unusual cold snap, Francis received a letter that would lead to an unexpected encounter. It came from a prison chaplain in Regina Coeli, Rome's historic prison located not far from the Vatican. "Your Holiness, I write regarding a matter that may seem unusual, but which has taken on spiritual significance for several inmates in my care. They have followed with interest the stories about your dog, Gaucho, and have expressed how this aspect of your papacy has made the church seem more accessible to them. Many of these men have been separated not just from society, but from the simple comforts of normal life, including, for those who had them, beloved pets. The prison has recently implemented a small therapy dog program, which has shown remarkable results in helping inmates process trauma and develop empathy. The men have asked if it might be possible, and I recognize the improbability of this request, for your Holiness to visit with Gaucho. They believe such an encounter would be a powerful symbol of the Church's concern for those society has rejected. I present this request with humility, fully understanding the security and logistical challenges it would entail. With filial devotion, Father Giovanni Bertolini, SRE, Chaplain, Regina Coeli Prison." Francis read the letter twice, struck by its unusual nature, but also by the authentic pastoral insight it contained. He had visited prisons regularly throughout his papacy, believing strongly in Christ's identification with prisoners. "I was in prison and you visited me, but bringing Gaucho into such a setting would be unprecedented." After consulting with Vatican security and the prison authorities, a plan was developed. Rather than a full papal visit, which would involve elaborate protocols and disruption to the prison's routine, Francis would make a private, low-key visit to meet with a small group of inmates participating in the therapy dog program. And so, on a cold February morning, Francis arrived at Regina Coeli Prison, accompanied only by his personal secretary, 2 security officers, and Gaucho. They were met by Father Bertolini, a fellow Jesuit whom Francis had known years earlier when both were involved in formation work. As they moved through the prison corridors, Francis was struck, as always, by the institutional starkness of such facilities, the echoing sounds, the pervasive sense of confinement, the visible reminders of society's determination to separate these men from the outside world. Gaucho walked calmly beside him, seemingly untroubled by the unusual environment. The chapel was simple but dignified, with wooden pews and modest religious artwork. Waiting inside were 8 men of various ages, seated in a semicircle rather than in the pews. 2 dogs, a golden retriever and a black Labrador, sat with their handlers nearby. When Francis entered, the men rose respectfully, many looking not at the Pope, but at Gaucho, with expressions of anticipation. Francis greeted each one individually, asking their names and exchanging a few words, before taking a seat that had been arranged as part of the circle rather than apart from it. "Thank you for inviting us," he began simply. "Gaucho and I are both honored to be here with you today." One of the men, older than the others with graying hair and weathered features, spoke up. "Holy Father, seeing your dog in the news, it reminded me that even the Pope is human, with normal human connections. It made the church feel closer somehow." Francis nodded. "God often works through the simplest things to bridge the distances we create between ourselves. Can he visit with us?" Another inmate asked, gesturing toward Gaucho, who sat attentively beside Francis's chair. "Of course, Sir," Francis replied. "He's quite sociable." At a signal from Francis, Gaucho rose and approached the men, moving from one to another with gentle curiosity. The inmates' reactions were varied but uniformly emotional. Some reached out eagerly to pet him, others more hesitantly, as if unaccustomed to gentle touch of any kind. "I had a dog like him," said a young man, perhaps in his 20s, as Gaucho allowed him to scratch behind his ears. Before everything went wrong." "What was your dog's name?" Francis asked. "Paco," the young man replied, his eyes fixed on Gaucho. "He probably doesn't remember me now. My mother took him when I was arrested 3 years ago." Francis nodded sympathetically. "Dogs remember more than we sometimes think. Their capacity for loyalty is remarkable." The conversation flowed naturally from there, the men sharing stories of pets they had known, of the comfort they found in the prison's therapy dog program, of the challenges of incarceration and their hopes for eventual reintegration into society. Throughout it all, Gaucho moved among them, occasionally returning to Francis, but spending most of the time offering his calm presence to these men, starved for uncomplicated connection. One of the inmates, a middle-aged man with intricate tattoos visible on his forearms, asked a question that shifted the conversation to deeper territory. "Holy Father, do you think animals have souls? Will we see them again in heaven?" Francis considered the question thoughtfully. "The Church teaches that animals have a different kind of soul than humans, not immortal in the same way as the human soul created in God's image. But God's redemptive plan encompasses all creation, not just humanity. St. Paul writes that creation itself will be set free from its bondage to decay and will obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God." He paused, looking at Gaucho, who was now resting his head on the knee of an elderly inmate who stroked his fur with trembling hands. "The exact nature of creation's renewal is a mystery, but I believe God values the unique goodness of each creature he has made. Nothing that has true value is lost in God's economy of salvation." The visit to Regina Coeli remained private at Francis's request. No photographers were present, no press release issued, but word inevitably spread through the Vatican grapevine and eventually reached the media. The Pope and his dog had visited prisoners, creating a moment of connection that transcended the usual boundaries of papal activity. As spring arrived in Rome, bringing its explosion of flowers to the Vatican gardens, Francis found himself increasingly aware of the passage of time. At 81, with a lifetime of pastoral service behind him, he felt both the weight of accumulated experience and the limitations of advancing age. His morning walks with Gaucho were taken at a slightly slower pace, his workday structured to include brief periods of rest. Gaucho, too, was showing subtle signs of aging. Now approximately 9 years old, his exact age had been uncertain when he came from Buenos Aires. The dog moved with slightly less exuberance, though his attentiveness and calm demeanor remained unchanged. Dr. Rossi, during a routine checkup, had pronounced him in excellent health for his age, but had noted the beginnings of arthritis in his hips, a condition that would require monitoring and eventually treatment. "You and I are on parallel journeys, it seems," Francis told him after this diagnosis, both feeling the effects of time's passage. One warm April morning, as they walked through a particularly beautiful section of the gardens where spring flowers created a riot of color, Francis found himself reflecting on mortality, his own and eventually Gaucho's. The thought brought not fear or sadness, but a kind of peaceful acceptance, a recognition that all life moves through its natural cycles under God's providence. "The challenge," he said to Gaucho, who walked beside him with his characteristic attentive presence, "is to age with grace, to accept the limitations that come with time while continuing to offer what gifts we still possess. The dog glanced up at him as if considering this philosophical observation. "You're managing it better than I am," Francis added with a small smile. "You don't fight against your changing capabilities or cling to what's passing away." As they rounded a bend in the path, Francis saw a familiar figure seated on a bench ahead. Cardinal Turkson, the Ghanaian prelate who headed the dicastery for promoting integral human development. The cardinal rose as Francis approached. "Your Holiness," he greeted him warmly. "I hoped I might encounter you this morning. The gardens are particularly beautiful today." "Indeed they are," Francis agreed. Creation preaching its annual sermon on resurrection and renewal. Cardinal Turkson bent to greet Gaucho, who responded with dignified courtesy. "He's looking well," the cardinal observed, "though perhaps a bit gray around the muzzle, like many of us." Francis smiled. "We're both showing our age. Dr. Rossi says he has the beginnings of arthritis, something I understand all too well." They walked together for a while, discussing the dicastery's ongoing work on environmental issues, migration, and economic justice. Cardinal Turkson had been a key collaborator in the development of Laudato Si', Francis's encyclical on care for our common home, and continued to lead Vatican efforts to implement its vision. As they parted ways near the entrance to the papal apartments, Cardinal Turkson offered a final observation. "Your Holiness, I believe Gaucho has become a kind of parable in action, a living illustration of the church you are calling us to be. Attentive, present to suffering, uninterested in status, faithful in companionship." Francis smiled. "If only all my theological points could be communicated so effectively." One rainy afternoon, as Francis sat at his desk reviewing correspondence while Gaucho dozed nearby, Father Paulo entered with an unexpected communication. "Your Holiness," he said, "we've received a letter from Sister Lucia at the Little Sisters of the Poor in Buenos Aires. She was a close colleague of Sister Maria Concepcion." Francis looked up with interest. "The sister who sent Gaucho to us?" "Yes, Your Holiness. Sister Lucia writes that she was going through Sister Maria's personal effects, which had been stored since her death, and found a sealed letter addressed to you, with instructions that it should be delivered when the time seems right." Father Paulo handed Francis an envelope, yellowed slightly with age, bearing his name, not his papal title, but simply Jorge Bergoglio, written in a shaky hand he recognized as Sister Maria's. "Thank you," Francis said, taking the envelope with a sense of both curiosity and reverence. When Father Paulo had departed, Francis examined the envelope for a moment before carefully opening it. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered with Sister Maria's distinctive handwriting, dated just 2 weeks before her death. "My dear Jorge," for you are still Jorge to those of us who knew you before. "By the time you read this, I will have gone to the Lord, and Gaucho will have been with you for some time. I pray that he has been the companion I believed you needed, not just for yourself personally, though that too, but for the mission God has entrusted to you. Unam." When you were chosen as Pope, I rejoiced but also worried. I knew the weight that would descend on your shoulders, the isolation that comes with such a position. I remembered our conversations about St. Francis of Assisi and his special connection to all creatures. And I thought of Gaucho, how his presence had been a healing gift to our community, how he seemed to understand human suffering without being overwhelmed by it. Something told me, call it an old woman's intuition or perhaps the Holy Spirit's whisper, that this dog had a purpose beyond our convent walls, that in some small way he might help you demonstrate the church you are calling us to be, attentive to suffering, unimpressed by status, faithful in companionship, joyful despite difficulties. Forgive an old nun's presumption in sending such an unusual gift to a pope, but I have lived long enough to know that God often works through the simplest instruments, and that sometimes the most profound ministry happens without words. May Gaucho remind you in moments of papal solitude that you are never truly alone, that God's love surrounds you in ways both extraordinary and ordinary, both sacred and mundane. With affection and prayers, Sister Maria Concepcion. Francis read the letter twice. deeply moved by Sister Maria's insight and the intentionality behind what he had initially seen as an unusual but relatively simple gesture. She had understood something he himself had only gradually discovered, that Gaucho would become not just a personal companion, but a living embodiment of aspects of his papal ministry. She saw more clearly than I did, he said softly to Gaucho, who had awakened and now watched him with attentive eyes. The ways God would use your presence. The dog rose and came to him, placing his head on Francis's knee in the gesture that had become their shared language of comfort and connection. Francis stroked his head, noting the increased gray around his muzzle, the slight cloudiness beginning in his eyes, signs of age that mirrored his own journey. We have been given to each other for a purpose, he murmured, not just for companionship, though that has been precious, but for ministry, for demonstrating through our relationship something of how God accompanies humanity. As spring deepened into summer, Francis continued his regular duties while preparing for a significant upcoming event, the Synod on Youth, the Faith, and Vocational Discernment scheduled for October. The preparatory documents had been circulated, consultations conducted worldwide, and the Vatican was now in the final stages of organizing what Francis hoped would be a meaningful opportunity for the Church to listen to young people's experiences and concerns. One particularly warm June morning, as Francis and Gaucho took their usual walk in the gardens, they encountered a group of young seminarians from the North American College who were being given a tour by their rector. The young men, initially awestruck at the unexpected encounter with the Pope, visibly relaxed when they noticed Gaucho at his side. "Good morning," Francis greeted them warmly. "Are you enjoying your time in Rome?" "Yes, Holy Father," several answered almost in unison, their nervousness evident. Francis smiled, gesturing toward Gaucho. "Perhaps you'd like to meet my companion. He's often better at breaking the ice than I am." The suggestion immediately transformed the atmosphere. The seminarians gathered around, their formal reserve giving way to more natural enthusiasm as they greeted Gaucho, who responded with his characteristic dignified friendliness. "I had a dog just like him growing up," one young man said, kneeling to stroke Gaucho's head. "It's one of the things I miss most in seminary, that uncomplicated companionship." "What's your name?" Francis asked. "Michael, Your Holiness, from the Diocese of Portland, Maine." "And what led you to the seminary, Michael?" The question, asked in the context of this unexpected informal encounter, elicited a response more authentic than might have emerged in a more structured setting. The young man spoke of his journey of faith, his questions and certainties, his hopes for ministry, and his concerns about the challenges facing the Church. Other seminarians joined the conversation, which gradually expanded to touch on their experiences of formation, their perspectives on evangelizing their peers, and their thoughts on how the Church might better engage with young people's questions and concerns. Francis listened attentively, occasionally asking questions, but mostly creating space for their voices. Throughout it all, Gaucho moved among the group, his presence helping to maintain the informal, genuine quality of the exchange. Before departing, Francis offered a specific invitation. The Synod on Youth is approaching in October. While you won't be formal participants, your perspectives as young men preparing for priesthood are valuable. I'd welcome a written reflection from your community on how you believe the Church can better accompany young people in their faith journey. As the October Synod approached, Francis found himself returning to an insight repeatedly, allowing it to inform his approach to the gathering. When he addressed the Synod Fathers in his opening remarks, he emphasized the importance of listening before speaking, of accompanying young people in their questions rather than merely providing pre-formulated answers. The Church grows by attraction, not proselytism, he reminded them. And what attracts is authentic witness, our willingness to walk with others in their joys and struggles, to be present without imposing, to offer the gospel as an invitation rather than an imposition. Throughout the Synod, Francis maintained a posture of active listening, creating space for diverse voices, including those of the young auditors whose perspectives often challenge conventional ecclesiastical thinking. The process was not without tensions, as different visions of the Church's relationship with contemporary culture emerged, but the overall spirit was one of genuine dialogue rather than polarized debate, One evening, midway through the synod, Francis received a visit from a young woman who had spoken particularly powerfully during that day's session. Maria Torres, a youth minister from Mexico, had described her work with young people in areas affected by drug violence and poverty, challenging the Synod Fathers to consider how the Church might more effectively address the structural injustices that shape these young people's lives. "Your Holiness," she said as she entered his study, her initial nervousness giving way to surprise as she noticed Gaucho rising from his bed to greet her. "Oh, I didn't expect to meet your dog," Francis smiled. "Gaucho is an essential part of my household. Please feel free to greet him if you wish." Maria knelt immediately, her face lighting up as she extended her hand to Gaucho, who approached with his characteristic gentle curiosity. "I work with therapy dogs in our youth program," she explained as she stroked his head. "They connect with young people who won't talk to adults, who've seen too much violence to trust easily. Animals often reach places in the heart that words cannot," Francis observed. Their conversation continued, moving from Maria's work in Mexico to broader questions about the Church's engagement with young people facing severe challenges: violence, poverty, forced migration, environmental degradation. Throughout it all, Gaucho remained beside Maria's chair, occasionally placing his head on her knee as if offering comfort when she spoke of particularly painful realities. "The young people I work with don't need theological explanations," she said at one point. "They need to know they're not alone, that someone sees their suffering and stands with them in it." Francis nodded. Presence precedes proclamation. This is the pattern Jesus himself established, being with people in their concrete situations before speaking of God's kingdom. As their meeting drew to a close, Maria hesitated, then asked a question that clearly had been on her mind. "Holy Father, may I ask, what has your dog taught you? About ministry, about being present to others?" The question, asked with genuine curiosity rather than as a polite formality, touched Francis deeply. "More than I initially expected," he admitted. "Gaucho has taught me about attentiveness, about being fully present to whoever is before me, rather than distracted by what came before or what comes next, about offering companionship without trying to fix or change the other, about the eloquence of silent presence when words would only intrude." The years passed, as they inevitably do, marked by the rhythm of liturgical seasons, global events, and the ongoing life of the Church. Francis continued his papacy with the same commitment to reform, to the preferential option for the poor, to dialogue across divisions that had characterized it from the beginning, and through it all, Gaucho remained his faithful companion, his presence a constant amid the changes and challenges of papal life. Gaucho's advancing age brought increasing limitations. The arthritis in his hips progressed, requiring stronger medication and eventually restricting their walks to shorter distances. His hearing began to fade, though he remained remarkably attuned to Francis's voice and movements. His once caramel coat became increasingly sprinkled with gray, matching Francis's own white hair and beard. Dr. Rossi visited regularly, monitoring Gaucho's condition with professional care tempered by evident affection for her unusual patient. "He's aging gracefully," she would report, "still enjoying good quality of life despite his limitations." Francis ensured that Gaucho's care remained a priority, adjusting his own schedule when necessary to accommodate his companion's needs. The dog's bed was moved closer to his own to minimize painful movement during the night. Their walks, though shorter, remained a daily constant, an opportunity for shared presence that both treasured. In Gaucho's 12th year, as winter gave way to spring in Rome, Francis noticed a gradual decline in his companion's energy and appetite. Dr. Rossi, summoned for an examination, confirmed his observations with gentle directness. "His kidney function is deteriorating, Your Holiness," she explained after conducting tests. "It's not uncommon in dogs his age, but it is a serious concern. We can manage it with medication and diet for now, but you should be prepared." She didn't need to complete the sentence. Francis nodded, accepting the reality with the same clear-eyed faith that had characterized his approach to life's joys and sorrows throughout his ministry. "We will make his remaining time as comfortable and dignified as possible," he said simply. The months that followed took on a bittersweet quality for Francis. Each day with Gaucho became more precious, each shared moment stored carefully in memory. Their walks grew shorter still, often limited to a slow circuit of the nearest section of the Vatican gardens. But these moments of companionship, of shared presence in creation, remained a cornerstone of Francis's day. One particularly warm evening in July, as Francis sat on the small balcony outside his study enjoying a slight breeze, Gaucho lay beside his chair, his breathing labored despite the moderate temperature. The Pope stroked his head gently, noting how the once thick fur had thinned, how the intelligent eyes had clouded with age. "We've traveled a long road together, haven't we, old friend?" he said softly. "From that first uncertain meeting in the gardens to this, a journey neither of us could have anticipated." Gaucho's tail moved slightly in response to his voice. A ghost of the more vigorous greeting of earlier years, but a response nonetheless. "You've taught me more than I expected," Francis continued. "About presence, about listening, about the ministry of being with that lies at the heart of the gospel." The end came peacefully 3 days later. Francis awoke in the pre-dawn hours to find Gaucho struggling to breathe, clearly in distress despite the medications that had been managing his symptoms. A call to Dr. Rosie brought her quickly to the papal apartment, where her examination confirmed what Francis already knew in his heart. "His systems are shutting down, Your Holiness," she said gently. "We can take him to the clinic for more aggressive intervention. But at this point, that would likely prolong his suffering rather than restore his health." Francis nodded, his decision clear though painful. "Then we will help him go peacefully, here in his home, with dignity." Dr. Rossi prepared the necessary injection while Francis sat on the floor beside Gaucho's bed, cradling the dog's head in his lap and speaking softly to him in Spanish. Words of gratitude, of blessing, of farewell. Throughout his long life of pastoral ministry, he had accompanied many people in their final moments. Now he offered that same ministry of presence to his faithful companion. "Go in peace, good and faithful friend," he whispered as Dr. Rossi administered the medication that would end Gaucho's suffering. "Return to the Creator who made you so good, who gave you to me as an unexpected gift." Gaucho's eyes remained fixed on Francis's face as the medication took effect, his breathing gradually slowing until, with a final soft sigh, it ceased altogether. The Pope continued to hold him, tears flowing freely down his face as he offered a prayer of thanksgiving for the life they had shared. Later that day, in a quiet corner of the Vatican gardens that had been one of their favorite spots, Gaucho was laid to rest in a simple ceremony attended only by those closest to Francis. Father Paolo Marco, who had helped care for Gaucho throughout his time at the Vatican, Cardinal Parolin, and a few others who had been part of their shared life. Francis himself spoke the words of blessing, drawing on the rich tradition of his namesake, Saint Francis of Assisi, who had recognized the sacredness of all creation. "Blessed are you, Lord God, maker of all living creatures. You called forth fish in the sea, birds in the air, and animals on the land. You inspired Saint Francis to call all of them his brothers and sisters. We ask you to bless Gaucho, who brought joy and companionship to so many. May we always praise you for all your beauty in creation. Blessed are you, Lord our God, and all your creatures. Amen." As the small gathering dispersed, Cardinal Parolin remained behind with Francis, standing beside him in silent solidarity as he placed a simple wooden marker at the grave, a cross with Gaucho's name, and the years of his life, accompanied by a quote from Laudato Si: "Each creature has its own purpose. None is superfluous." "He changed my papacy," Francis said quietly, "in ways I never anticipated when Sister Maria sent him to me." Cardinal Parolin nodded. "He became a kind of ambassador of your vision for the Church, a living demonstration of accompaniment, of meeting people where they are rather than where we think they should be." "God works through the simplest instruments," Francis replied, "perhaps especially when we become too complicated in our thinking, too removed from the essential." In the days that followed, as news of Gaucho's passing spread through the Vatican and beyond, Francis was deeply touched by the outpouring of sympathy and shared memories. Letters arrived from people around the world who had been moved by the relationship between the Pope and his dog, children who had drawn pictures of them together, elderly people who found comfort in seeing a pope who valued companionship, individuals who had encountered them during papal audiences or visits. One letter particularly moved him, from the young woman who had been imprisoned in Morocco when Francis and Gaucho visited the migrant center there years earlier. Now resettled in France, she wrote of how that encounter had given her hope during her darkest time. "Your dog came to me when I was telling you about losing my daughter. He seemed to understand my pain in a way that needed no words. In that moment, I felt God had not abandoned me, that if this creature could see and respond to my suffering, surely God could as well. This gave me strength to continue, to eventually find my daughter, to rebuild our life together." Gaucho was God's instrument of hope for me. Several weeks after Gaucho's death, as Francis took a solitary walk in the gardens one early morning, he found himself at the simple grave that marked his companion's resting place. The sun was just rising, casting long shadows across the carefully tended landscape and illuminating the small wooden marker with golden light. Francis stood there quietly, offering a prayer of gratitude for the years of companionship they had shared. As he turned to continue his walk, he noticed Cardinal Sarah approaching along the path, an unexpected encounter given the early hour. "Your Holiness," the Cardinal greeted him with a respectful bow. "I hope I'm not intruding on your solitude." "Not at all, Ninan," Francis assured him. "The gardens are for all who seek a moment of peace." Cardinal Sarah glanced at Gaucho's grave, then back at Francis. "I wanted to express my condolences on the loss of your companion. I know he meant a great deal to you." "Thank you," Francis replied, touched by this gesture from a cardinal who had often represented a more traditional perspective than his own. He was a faithful friend through some challenging years. They walked together for a while in companionable silence before Cardinal Sarah spoke again. "If I may, Your Holiness, I've been reflecting on what your relationship with Gaucho represented. Though we have sometimes differed on matters of emphasis or approach, I believe he embodied something we both value: the importance of faithful presence, of accompanying others without agenda or condition." Francis nodded, appreciating the Cardinal's insight. That was his gift, to be fully present, attentive to what was before him, rather than distracted by what came before or what might come next. "A quality we might all aspire to cultivate," the Cardinal observed, "particularly in our polarized times, when we often listen only to confirm our existing perspectives, rather than to truly understand the other." As autumn returned to Rome, bringing cooler temperatures and the gradual turning of leaves in the Vatican gardens, Francis continued to feel Gaucho's absence in his daily routines. Yet alongside the sadness came a growing sense of gratitude for what their relationship had meant, not just personally, but for his understanding of ministry and for the Church's witness in the world. One particularly meaningful acknowledgement of this legacy came in an unexpected form. A group of young artists from various countries, inspired by Francis's emphasis on care for creation and human fraternity, created a children's book titled The Pope's Faithful Friend. With simple text and beautiful illustrations, it told the story of Francis and Gaucho, emphasizing how their relationship had demonstrated the Pope's vision of a church that accompanied those in need with compassionate presence. When a copy was presented to Francis during a general audience, he was deeply moved, not just by the book itself, but by the letter that accompanied it from the young authors. "Dear Pope Francis, we created this book because we believe the story of you and Gaucho helps children understand important things about God's love and how we should treat each other. Just as you were kind to Gaucho and he was faithful to you, we can learn to be kind and faithful friends to people who are different from us. We are sorry that Gaucho is now in heaven, but we are happy that his story can still teach people about love and friendship. Your friends and the young artists for peace." Francis wrote a personal note of thanks to the children, affirming their insight that sometimes the simplest stories contain the deepest truths about how God calls us to live together as brothers and sisters in our common home. As spring returned to Rome, bringing its explosion of new life to the Vatican gardens, Francis found himself drawn increasingly to the quiet corner where Gaucho had been laid to rest. The simple wooden marker had weathered the winter rains, and now small wildflowers bloomed around it. a fitting tribute to a creature who had embodied natural grace and uncomplicated goodness. During one such visit, as Francis stood in silent reflection beside the grave, he was joined by Archbishop Georg Genswein, who had continued to serve as a bridge between Francis and the Pope Emeritus Benedict. "Your Holiness," the Archbishop greeted him respectfully. "The Pope Emeritus asked me to tell you that he continues to pray for you, especially as you mark this time of remembrance." Francis nodded gratefully. "Please convey my thanks for his prayers and assure him of mine in return." They stood together for a moment in companionable silence before the Archbishop spoke again. He also shared a theological reflection that he thought might bring you comfort. He reminded me of Augustine's teaching that in the resurrection, all that we have truly loved will be restored to us in a more perfect form, not just human relationships, but all that has contributed to genuine goodness and love in our lives. Francis smiled. "Benedict's theological depth continues to nourish the Church. Please thank him for this reminder of the hope that sustains us all." As they walked back toward the Vatican buildings, the Archbishop offered a final observation. "The Pope Emeritus also noted that your companion served as a kind of bridge between different perspectives within the Church. People who might disagree strongly on theological or ecclesiastical matters could find common ground in appreciating this relationship that spoke to something more fundamental than our divisions." "Gaucho was better at ecumenism than many of us trained in dialogue," Francis agreed with a small smile. He recognized the person beneath the position, the shared humanity beneath the differing perspectives. The observation stayed with Francis in the days that followed, informing his approach to several challenging situations that required navigating tensions within the Church. In meetings with bishops representing different theological emphases, in addressing questions about liturgical practice that had become unfortunately politicized, in responding to concerns about his reform initiatives, he found himself consciously trying to embody the approach Gaucho had demonstrated so naturally, seeing the person beneath the position, remaining in relationship across differences, offering presence without judgment. As his papacy continued into its later years, Francis increasingly recognized how his time with Gaucho had shaped his understanding of ministry in ways that would endure beyond their shared journey. One particularly significant moment came during the preparation of his next encyclical, which would address themes of human fraternity and social friendship. As Francis reviewed the draft with his theological advisors, he found himself drawing on insights that had crystallized through his years with Gaucho. The document needs to emphasize more clearly that authentic encounter precedes dialogue, he noted during one session. That being present to the other, truly seeing them as they are rather than as we wish them to be, is the foundation for meaningful exchange across differences. Cardinal Michael Czerny, who was coordinating the drafting process, nodded thoughtfully. "This reflects Your Holiness's consistent emphasis on the culture of encounter. Perhaps we could develop this section further with concrete examples." "Yes," Francis agreed, "and we should note that such encounter doesn't require agreement on all matters. Only a willingness to recognize the other's inherent dignity and to remain in relationship across differences." As the discussion continued, Francis found himself repeatedly drawing on lessons learned through his relationship with Gaucho: the power of attentive presence, the dignity of all creation, the ministry of accompaniment that transcended words. These insights, born from daily companionship with a creature who communicated without language, had deepened his understanding of how human beings might bridge their own divides. When the encyclical Fratelli Tutti was finally published in October, many commentators noted its emphasis on concrete relationship as the foundation for addressing global challenges, from economic inequality to environmental degradation, from polarized politics to religious conflict. Few recognize how much of this vision had been shaped and refined through Francis's years with a caramel-colored dog who had embodied these principles in his own simple way. As Christmas approached, the first without Gaucho's presence, Francis found himself reflecting on the mystery of incarnation with renewed perspective. The God who chose to enter human history as a vulnerable infant, dependent on care and relationship, had revealed something essential about divine nature that often became obscured in abstract theology. "The Word became flesh and dwelt among us," he murmured during his private prayer one morning. "Not merely to deliver a message, but to be present, to accompany humanity in its joys and sorrows, to transform through the relationship what could never be changed through mere instruction." This insight informed his Christmas homily, delivered to a St. Peter's Basilica still operating under pandemic restrictions that limited attendance. Speaking to the smaller-than-usual congregation and to millions watching via broadcast, Francis emphasized how the Incarnation revealed God's commitment to presence rather than remote proclamation. In Jesus, God does not simply send instructions for human living, he preached. He enters into human experience, accompanies us in our struggles, shares our joys and sorrows. This divine choice to be with us rather than merely speak to us from a distance reveals the heart of God's love and the pattern for our own relationships with one another. Though he made no explicit reference to Gaucho, those who knew him well recognized how his years with his faithful companion had deepened his appreciation for this aspect of the Christmas mystery, the transformative power of presence that transcended words. In private conversations with those closest to him, Francis occasionally reflected on this unexpected dimension of his papacy. "When history looks back on these years," he told Cardinal Parolin during one such discussion, "the theological initiatives and structural reforms will certainly be noted. But perhaps equally significant was this simple relationship that reminded the Church and the world of something essential about God's way of being with us." The Cardinal nodded thoughtfully. "Gaucho became a kind of living parable of the Church you have been calling us to be, attentive to suffering, unimpressed by status, faithful in accompaniment. God often speaks most clearly through the simplest instruments," Francis observed, "perhaps especially when we become too complicated in our thinking, too removed from the essential." As the years passed, the story of Francis and Gaucho became part of the broader narrative of his papacy. Not its central feature, certainly, but a meaningful dimension that illustrated in living form the vision of church he had sought to foster. The image of the Pope walking in the Vatican gardens with his faithful companion became iconic, representing a papacy characterized by accessibility, by emphasis on concrete relationship over abstract principle, by attentiveness to the overlooked dimensions of creation and human experience. For Francis himself, however, Gaucho remained not a symbol, but a beloved companion whose presence had transformed his experience of the papacy in ways both profound and ordinary. Each morning as he walked through the gardens, passing the quiet corner where his friend rested, he offered a prayer of gratitude for their shared journey, for the unexpected gift that had come through the insight of an Argentine nun who had recognized a connection before it even existed. "Thank you, old friend," he would sometimes murmur, pausing briefly beside the simple marker now surrounded by flourishing plants, "for teaching this old theologian new lessons about presence, about accompaniment, about the ministry of being with that lies at the heart of the gospel." And in those moments, Francis could almost imagine Gaucho walking beside him still, attentive, faithful, embodying in his simple canine way the profound truth that had animated his papacy from the beginning, that God's love is communicated most effectively not through pronouncements from on high, but through compassionate presence alongside those who suffer, those who question, those who seek meaning in a complex and often wounded world. It was a legacy of love that would continue to shape the Church and its ministry long after both Pope and Dog had completed their earthly journeys. A reminder that sometimes the most profound theology is written not in scholarly texts, but in the simple, faithful relationships that reflect, however imperfectly, the God who chooses to be Emmanuel, God with us. Years later, long after Francis himself had completed his earthly journey, a young priest visiting Rome would pause before a small, weathered marker in a quiet corner of the Vatican gardens. The inscription was simple, just a name, dates, and a brief quote from Laudato Si. Each creature has its own purpose. None is superfluous. The priest had heard the story, of course. The tale of the Pope and his dog had become part of the Church's collective memory, a touchstone frequently referenced in discussions of Francis's papacy and its emphasis on the culture of encounter. But standing there in the peaceful garden, the young priest felt he understood something more profound than what history books had recorded. In a church often divided by ideology, in a world increasingly fragmented by technology and polarization, the relationship between an aging pontiff and his faithful companion had demonstrated something essential about the gospel itself, that before doctrine comes presence, before teaching comes accompaniment, before speaking comes listening. The priest knelt briefly, touching the weathered marker with reverence. In his ministry among the urban poor of his own country, he had tried to embody this approach, to be present before preaching, to accompany before advising, to listen before speaking. It wasn't always easy in a world that valued quick solutions and clear answers, but he had found it to be the only authentic way to share the love of Christ with those who struggle. Rising, he noticed a small plaque nearby that he hadn't seen at first. It contained words attributed to Pope Francis himself, apparently spoken near the end of his life when asked about the significance of his years with Gaucho. Perhaps the most profound ministry is simply being with another in their joy and sorrow, offering not solutions but presence, not answers but attentive love. This is how God comes to us in Christ and how we are called to be with one another. Sometimes it takes a creature without words to teach us the eloquence of compassionate presence. The priest smiled, feeling a renewed sense of purpose in his own vocation. As he walked back towards St. Peter's Basilica, he found himself praying for the grace to embody this ministry of presence, to be, in his own small way, a reflection of the God who chooses not to remain distant, but to walk beside us on our journey, attentive to our struggles, faithful in companionship, transforming through loving presence what could never be changed through mere instruction. It was, he reflected, the enduring legacy of an unlikely papal companion, a caramel-colored dog named Gaucho, who had helped a pope demonstrate the church he was calling into being. A church that accompanies, that listens before speaking, that recognizes the sacred dignity of all creation, that seeks to be present at the margins where God's love is most urgently needed. A church that understands that sometimes the most profound ministry happens without words,